big sermon. All of my pastor friends have been thinking about the sermon for a while because there's a lot there. It's a big, big passage. Some of this passage deals with stuff which is very controversial. It's been very controversial in the church for a long time. I want to focus on this passage about divorce. These issues have divided congregations, have caused new denominations to form, and we continue to debate within our culture and within our churches the right way that we are to relate to each other and how we are to deal with our human brokenness as God's children. It's controversial stuff. Therefore, it's hard to preach. This isn't stuff where we all agree. This isn't stuff where we're all on the same page, right? This isn't one of those slam dunks sermons, God is love. Anybody disagree? No, we all agree. Contentiousness of these issues, however, makes these words important for us. But I think the contentiousness also points to the ways in which we have correctly and incorrectly interpreted God's law for our lives today. We have done a great amount of harm to one another when we misinterpret God's law in a way that can be destructive. And so I think it is important to back up a little bit and look at the context, theologically, of God's law for us. And since there's a lot of people here today, who maybe weren't here the last couple of weeks, I want to back up and remind you of my last two sermons, because I've been planning ahead. Number one, 2 weeks ago, the Beatitudes. Jesus saw the crowds. He went up to the mountain, and after him he sat down and he gave his Sermon on the Mount. Jesus up on the mountain reminds us of Jesus as sort of the new Moses. The new Moses giving his law to his people. And as you remember, Moses gives God's law after God frees God's people from tyranny and oppression and slavery in Egypt. The law, the Ten Commandments in particular, are the ways in which God's liberated people shall live together in covenanted community. The purpose of the law is to secure the freedom from tyranny that God has won for us. And this is both a political freedom as well as a spiritual or existentialist freedom. God's law is to secure our freedom. It is for liberty, and it is to be in relationship with God. Jesus is a new Moses. You'll also remember in our passage on that same Sunday, we related that teaching to Micah 6:8. And what is required for us. Micah made the same move as Matthew and related God's teachings to God's acts of liberations. And Micah concluded his sermon by saying, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. God's law is in response to God's liberation, and is a means through which we are to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk with humility. God's law is about justice, kindness, humility, liberty, and covenant. And then last Sunday, we had a word from Isaiah, talking about the purposes of religion in general. And as you remember, Isaiah said, "Is this not the fast that I choose, but to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is this not to share your bread with the hungry, and to bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin." So again, in Isaiah, the strong sense of the purpose of God's law, the purpose of religion, the purpose of our faith, is to be freed from oppression, to be freed from slavery, from Pharaoh in Egypt, to break those bonds and to live as a covenanted community of love where we take care of and support each other so that each of us may attain our fullness in life, our fullness as human beings. purpose of the law is to restore us to our humanity in Isaiah. And then this morning we come to Deuteronomy, an even older part of the Bible. The law is laid out in very simple terms. If you do this, we live. If we fail to do this, we die. The purpose of the law is to bring us to life and prosperity. Life and prosperity. It's what theologically is a law for. It is for liberty. It is for covenant, for justice, kindness, and humility. It is for breaking the bonds of oppression. It is care for the poor, and it is for life. All this talk about rules and laws reminds me, a few years ago, this is when Sarah and I were first married, and it was New Year's Eve, and we had some friends over to our house to play Monopoly, as we awaited the clock to strike midnight. Remember the story, Sarah? And one of Sarah's friends really wanted to win at Monopoly. Actually, it was a mutual friend of a friend, so it wasn't even a friend of ours. Boy, this guest wanted to win at Monopoly. If you ever played Monopoly with someone who really wanted to win, woo, not much fun. And I'm not really a big Monopoly player. I don't play very often. I think I play about once every 15, 20 years. So I don't know the rules. I don't have them all memorized, but this person seemed to know what she was talking about. And as the game progressed, she wasn't winning right away, and we're going to end the game at midnight anyhow. And she started saying to us, well, she said, the rules say such and such and such and such and such. And the funny thing was, every time this new rule occurred, it always helped her get more money from the rest of us. And we didn't know. I didn't know. I wasn't going to look it up, Funny how that goes. Funny how we can make up rules just to make sure that we win the game, whether intentional or not. It is, as a side note, one of the intentions of the game Monopoly, that we would all come to understand the ways in which monopolistic economic systems can become unjust in their own way. It was an argument, in fact, against monopolies when the game was invented, sort of an interesting historical side note. But the point being that sometimes we make rules to promote justice and liberty and kindness, humility and life and liberty, and sometimes we make rules to protect ourselves, and to protect our sense of being comfortable, and to protect our chances of winning. There are other just and unjust ways of interpreting the law. As Presbyterians, we affirm the law. It is an important part of our theological heritage. It is something that makes us distinct and unique in our theological tradition as Protestants. We affirm that the law has a purpose towards justice and kindness and peace in our world. But we also recognize the ways in which the law can be misapplied. I think this passage here about divorce contains within it both a positive and negative way to be interpreted and applied. And I want you all to listen very closely to this passage and to see how this passage could be misinterpreted. Listen. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. Who is the one doing all the divorcing in this passage? He. It says so 3 times over, right? Him. And who is the one who might be unchaste in this passage? Her. Right? Her. So he, according to this passage in the Older Testament, can divorce her if she has been unchaste. Well, that's nice, if you're a he, but what about her? Is there anything in this passage that suggests the ways in which she could leave him if he's been unchaste or abusive or it's a bad marriage for a variety of reasons. Isn't this particular interpretation, including Matthew's reinterpretation, a way in which, if misinterpreted, men could control women and use women in a way that we don't allow women to control and to use men? Do you see the problem with this interpretation, or the way it could be misinterpreted? That if we use the law to build up our own power and privilege over one another, we, in fact, in a theological sense, have returned ourselves to Egypt. We have returned ourselves to a land of tyranny and injustice. When we use the law to control each other to maintain our own sense of comfort in the world. The law categorically assumes that one gender or person gets to say to another kind of person what's right and what's wrong. We run into problems in a hurry because humans have this proclivity towards tyranny and abuse of one another. It is a misinterpretation of the law when we use it as a means of promoting abuse. When we use it to hurt one another. Matthew meant well. He was responding to criticism from what scholars call formative Judaism. Matthew himself was a Jewish Christian, someone who believed in the importance of the law as we do as Presbyterians. He was defending accusations that people had that perhaps Christians were too slack in keeping the law, that Jesus' breaking of the Sabbath and the way the disciples washed their hands before eating meant that they were unholy. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is presented as defending, as fencing the law, as that this was a holy and a righteous community. But the mistake that was made is that it was only assumed that men were the ones making these kinds of decisions. And this passage has been used to disastrous effect in the church throughout history to keep women inside of abusive relationships. How can we interpret the Ten Commandments in a way which leads to justice, to peace, to covenant, to life, to humility, to kindness? How can we interpret the Ten Commandments in a way which leads us from Egypt to the Promised Land, from death to life? Is it not but understanding that the purpose of the law is a tool that God uses to bring us into loving and sustaining community? But the law is not our goal, but rather a tool through which we form human communities that are life-sustaining. Law is not to be a tool to hurt. It is to be a tool to build up and to comfort and to strengthen. We need love